So usually when you try to picture the inner workings of like a really massive multinational corporation, you probably imagine this sleek, sterile boardroom.
Right, like a big mahogany table, glass walls.
Exactly. You picture a CEO and a board of directors, and they're staring at these quarterly profit charts. They're deliberating over market share.
Yeah. Figuring out how to maximize shareholder value.
Right. And the decisions they make in that room, they definitely dictate the trajectory of a specific product line, like maybe a new smartphone architecture or the rollout of a new soft drink or how much a software subscription is going to cost.
Sure. And their reach is massive, obviously. But it is fundamentally compartmentalized.
Right, because the boundaries are, well, they're defined by the market itself.
Exactly. I mean, their decisions affect their employees and their shareholders and obviously their consumers.
Yeah.
But those executives are still operating within this much broader ecosystem that they absolutely do not control.
Yeah, they don't set the national interest rate. They don't dictate the price of the grain their employees eat for breakfast. And they certainly don't, run the entire national transportation grid.
No, of course not. That would be, well, unimaginable in a market economy.
But, and this is where we're going today,
Yeah.
I want you to imagine a scenario where those boundaries literally do not exist. Like, imagine if that boardroom didn't just control a single product line, but they actually, literally controlled the entire material reality of a whole continent.
It's almost impossible to wrap your head around, honestly.
It is every single loaf of bread baked in a bakery, every pair of boots stitched in a factory, every single tractor rolling off an assembly line.
The price of a train ticket from Moscow all the way to Vladivostok.
Exactly. The wages of a steel worker in the middle of the Ural Mountains. We are talking about a single board of directors running the largest country on Earth by landmass as one giant monopolistic vertically integrated firm.
And that concept right there is an incredibly potent framework for understanding the Soviet Union.
It really is.
Because when you look at the Politburo, not just as a political organ, but as the supreme executive board of what Alec Nove's terms USSR Ltd., the entire history of the 20th century takes on this completely different mechanical logic.
Yeah, USSR Ltd. just puts it in such sharp perspective.
It does. You start to see that their actions as political ideologues were completely inextricably interpenetrated by their function as supermanagers.
Right. They weren't just passing laws.
Exactly. They were personally managing supply chains. They were allocating raw materials. They were setting literal physical production quotas for hundreds of millions of people.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive today. We are going to map out the intellectual and the economic landscape of that ultimate experiment. And we're going to be using Alec Nove's really masterful text, An Economic History of the USSR, 1917-1991.
It's an incredible book. So rigorous.
It really is. But before we dig into the ledgers of USSR Ltd., I do want to establish some quick ground rules for our analysis today, just for you listening.
Always a good idea with this topic.
Right. Because we are looking at this purely as an economic machine. And that means we really need to strip away the usual Cold War rhetoric, the Marxist-Leninist political theology, and, the default Western capitalist critiques.
Yeah, we have to look at the mechanics, not the morality.
Exactly. We are maintaining strict analytical neutrality here. So our goal today isn't to judge the morality of the system or endorse any specific ideology, right-wing or left-wing.
Right.
Our goal is to just dissect the blueprints. We want to look at the cold, hard data, the scholarly debates, and the economic theories to understand exactly how this massive apparatus actually functioned, and structurally why it eventually tore itself completely apart.
And that analytical distance is so essential because the Soviet experiment was, at its very core, an attempt to forcefully apply a highly specific 19th century European economic philosophy to the unforgiving, really complex realities of a vast, backward, peasant majority empire.
Yeah, a total mismatch of theory and reality.
Exactly. If you get too caught up in the political theater, you miss that profound mechanical tension.
And identifying that tension is basically our grand question for this deep dive. It's the thread that connects the very first chapter of Nove's book all the way to the final pages describing the total systemic collapse in 1991.
Right.
I really want to trace how the foundational economic premise, which is, this realization that the state had to basically squeeze the agricultural peasant majority to fund rapid, heavy industrialization, how that premise dictated the brutal command policies of the 1930s.
And crucially, how that exact same foundational logic planted the structural seeds for the total disintegration of the economy like 7 decades later.
Exactly. So to really comprehend that whole arc, which is just a fascinating, tragic era of development economics, we kind of have to start at the baseline.
We have to look at what the Bolsheviks actually inherited, because they didn't just seize a blank slate in 1917.
Right. Not at all.
They took control of an economy that was rapidly changing, deeply flawed, and highly volatile.
So let's examine that pre-revolutionary baseline. If you look at 1913, Russia is obviously the least developed of the major European powers. But there's this assumption that it was just a stagnant, feudal backwater.
Yeah, which just isn't supported by the data.
Not at all. The Russian Empire was actually industrializing at a breakneck pace under Count Sergei Witt, who was the Tsar's Minister of Finance.
Right, and Witt is such a crucial figure for understanding the trajectory of the whole 20th century.
Tell us a bit about him. What was his mindset?
Well, Witt looked back at the trauma of the Crimean War and later the Russo-Japanese War, and he recognized this really harsh geopolitical reality. Basically, the Tsarist regime could not fight modern wars with dirt roads and peasant armies.
Yeah, military survival in the 20th century required heavy industry: steel, coal, railways.
Exactly. So Witt initiates this highly deliberate, state-sponsored industrialization drive in the 1890s. The state essentially acts as the primary engine for economic growth.
But, and this is the classic trap of development economics, right? The mechanics of actually paying for that industrialization are brutal.
Yeah. How do you finance it?
Right. If your country consists overwhelmingly of impoverished subsistence-level farmers, how do you pay for massive steel mills and thousands of miles of railway track?
You don't exactly have a wealthy, taxable middle class.
Exactly. And you don't have overseas colonies to extract wealth from, like Britain did. So Witt leans on two main pillars: massive foreign borrowing, primarily from the French, and ruthlessly taxing his own peasantry.
And that taxation strategy was incredibly deliberate.
Right.
By heavily taxing the peasants in cash, Witt forced them to sell whatever grain they had on the open market just so they could pay their tax bills.
Right.
And then the state aggressively exported that grain. The resulting agricultural trade surplus provided the foreign currency they desperately needed to service those French loans and to buy advanced industrial machinery from, like, Britain and Germany.
It's honestly the economic equivalent of burning your own seed corn to build a greenhouse. You are deliberately depressing the consumption and the living standards of your own population to finance long-term capital accumulation.
Yeah, it's a brutal squeeze.
There's this chilling observation in the text from an Austrian journalist, Hugo Gons. He's writing in 1904. He compared Tsarist Russia to an athlete suffering from an incurable heart weakness, who basically only manages to stay upright through the constant injection of stimulants.
Wow. And the stimulants are the foreign capital.
Exactly, the constant influx of foreign loans. And Gans accurately predicted that a catastrophic collapse was mathematically inevitable the moment those external stimulants were cut off, or if the internal stress just became too great.
And, I mean, the internal stress was already reaching a boiling point by then. Witt was extracting capital from a peasant population that was literally suffocating from what they called land hunger.
Right, because the emancipation of the serfs back in 1861, it was structurally flawed, wasn't it?
Deeply flawed. The peasants didn't just receive their land outright. They were saddled with these crushing redemption dues, basically mortgages they couldn't afford.
Oh, wow.
And they were bound to the mir, the village commune, which held the land collectively. So they were trapped in this cycle of collective debt, and their individual plot sizes were shrinking because the population was absolutely exploding.
Which perfectly brings us to a massive, massive theoretical roadblock for the Russian revolutionaries. It's something we can call a Marxist paradox.
Yes. This is where theory hits a brick wall.
Right, because Karl Marx built his entire economic theory around the observation of advanced industrialized capitalist societies, specifically Victorian England.
Right.
The orthodox Marxist sequence dictates that capitalism has to fully mature first. It has to generate the massive factories, consolidate the wealth, and create this vast, exploited urban proletariat.
And only then, only once the capitalist engine has basically built up the productive capacity of the society, can the proletariat seize the means of production and transition to socialism.
Right. That sequencing was considered like an iron law of history by orthodox Marxists.
But Russia blatantly defied that sequence.
Completely defied it. It was an agrarian empire. The industrial proletariat was this tiny, tiny fraction of the population, just totally surrounded by an ocean of peasants. So the paradox is How do you trigger a proletarian revolution in a society that hasn't even fully completed its capitalist phase?
It's such a fascinating dilemma. And what I found incredibly revealing is that Marx himself actually grappled with this exact question.
Oh, right, the letter from Vera Zasalik.
Yes. The text mentions this letter written to Marx by the Russian revolutionary Vera Zasalik. She essentially asks him point blank, does Russia have to suffer through the entire painful phase of capitalist development? Or can it use the traditional Russian peasant commune, the Up China, as a sort of shortcut?
Like a direct springboard right into rural socialism.
Exactly. And Marx's response was, well, hesitant, but he basically conceded that if a revolution in Russia sparked a broader European revolution, the rural commune might actually serve as a starting point.
Wow. But that letter, it didn't exactly become required reading for the Bolsheviks, did it?
No, it was buried. It was suppressed for decades by the foundational figures of Russian Marxism, like Georgy Plekhanov,
Why? Why did?
because they had already staked their entire political movement on the orthodox belief that capitalism was currently destroying the peasant commune, and that their sole task was to organize the urban working class.
Oh, I see.
If they admitted that peasant communalism could bypass capitalism, it would have destroyed their entire intellectual framework.
That makes sense. But then you have Lenin. And Lenin, acting as like the ultimate pragmatic tactician, he looks at the reality on the ground in 1917.
Right.
World War I has subjected Gantz's athlete with the weak heart to just unimaginable stress. The railway network has totally collapsed, the cities are literally starving, and the Tsarist state has imploded.
It's total systemic breakdown.
Exactly. So Lenin realizes, hey, I cannot wait for orthodox capitalism to mature here. That's a luxury we don't have. He realizes he has to harness the sheer, raw fury of the peasantry, their desperate hunger to seize the landlord's estates, to propel his vanguard party into power.
Even if those peasants care absolutely nothing about Marxist economic theory.
Right, they just wanted the land. So Lenin brilliantly fuses this minority urban proletarian coup with a massive, totally chaotic peasant land war.
Which is a brilliant political maneuver. But as they quickly found out, seizing the state apparatus is definitely not the same thing as managing an economy.
Yeah, slight difference there.
Just a bit. The Bolsheviks didn't inherit a functioning state that they could just neatly transition over to socialism. They inherited total systemic disintegration.
So let's transition into the mechanics of that disintegration. This is the period from roughly 1918 to 1921, the era of war communism.
It's a wild period.
It really is, because when we say the economy collapsed during the Civil War, we aren't just talking about, like, a severe recession or a depression. We are talking about the literal evaporation of money as a concept.
Yeah, to fund the Red Army during the Civil War, the government just printed rubles until the physical printing presses broke down.
Hyperinflation reached levels that basically break traditional economic modeling. The currency lost all function as a medium of exchange or a unit of account or a store of value. It was just paper.
The state budget became completely meaningless. Industrial enterprises, the few that were still running, they just stopped transacting with each other in financial terms.
Right. They had to rely on centralized physical accounting or just raw barter.
Exactly. And workers weren't getting paid in money. They received their wages in these really meager rations of bread and clothing. The government even declared things like public transport, postal services, and municipal housing to be free.
Wait, free? Was that like a socialist victory or?
Well, no. It was free simply because the administrative cost of collecting the worthless paper notes was higher than the value of the notes themselves.
Oh, wow. That is bleak. So, I mean, anyone looking at a modern economy where the currency has died and the urban populations are fleeing back to the countryside just to forage for food, any normal person would diagnose that as a catastrophic failure.
You think so, yeah.
But reading the reactions of the left-wing Bolshevik intellectuals at the time is absolutely mind-bending. They didn't see an apocalypse. They saw a theoretical triumph.
Yes. This is where ideology really creates a blind spot. You're referring to thinkers like Nicola Bukharin, right?
Exactly. Bukharin and his work on the economics of the transition period, he and others looked at the ruins of the market and theorized that this was the rapid, glorious dawn of true communism.
They coined this term, the naturalization of economic relations.
Right. And the idea there was that humanity was finally shedding the artificial, exploitative construct of money.
Exactly. People were interacting naturally. They were exchanging physical goods directly for physical needs without that corrupting mediation of a capitalist market.
In Bukharin's view, Every profound social revolution requires the violent shattering of the old relations of production. So, the death of the market wasn't an unfortunate side effect of the Civil War. It was the necessary clearing of the ideological ground.
It was proof that the capitalist system had been eradicated.
But the reality of that naturalization was incredibly violent. I mean, the cities weren't peacefully bartering with the countryside. The state was starving.
Yes.
So to keep the Red Army fighting, the government instituted the Prodrazvyorska. This was the mandatory requisitioning of agricultural surpluses.
And requisitioning is a very polite word for it. Armed detachments were sent out into the villages to forcibly extract grain from the peasants at gunpoint.
Right. The official rhetoric always claimed they were only targeting the kulaks, the wealthy, exploitative peasants who were supposedly hoarding grain, but the mechanical reality.
The mechanical reality was that these requisition squads just took whatever grain they could find from whoever had it.
Yeah.
They often confiscated the seed grain that the peasants needed for the next year's planting. It utterly destroyed any economic incentive for the peasantry to produce anything beyond their own immediate day-to-day survival needs.
Because why would you grow extra if guys with guns are just going to take it?
Exactly.
This introduces a fascinating framework from the economist John Kenneth Galbraith. He has this analogy of the rotting door.
Oh, I love this analogy.
It's so good. Galbraith suggests that a man who kicks in a rotting door gets an entirely unjustified reputation for violence. And applied here, the question is, did the Bolsheviks actually possess the administrative capacity to command the destruction of the market? Or did they simply kick a door that World War I had already rotted through and then proudly take credit for the collapsing house?
And that right there is the pivotal historiographical debate regarding war communism. Were these extreme policies of nationalization and grain requisitioning driven by an ideological blueprint? Or were they just desperate, improvised reactions to a brutal military crisis?
What does the text suggest?
Well, the evidence strongly points to a toxic synthesis of both. The Bolsheviks were undeniably forced into grain requisitioning just to survive. They had no consumer goods to trade for the grain, so violence was basically the only mechanism left.
Right.
However, their specific ideological conditioning caused them to interpret these desperate, chaotic measures as immense socialist victories.
They took a bug of the wartime economy and mentally reclassified it as a feature of the socialist utopia.
Exactly. A perfect way to put it.
And that psychological leap is why war communism is so absolutely vital to understanding everything that follows in Soviet history. It hardwired a very specific methodology into the DNA of the Communist Party.
It taught a whole generation of young, hardened party cadres that extreme coercion, state violence, and the total eradication of market forces could actually yield immediate results.
It created this leap-forward psychology, and even though it laid kind of dormant during the 1920s, it was resurrected by Stalin with terrifying scale in the 1930s.
But the consequences of that illusion, they hit a massive brick wall in 1921.
Yeah, reality reasserts itself.
The Bolsheviks won the military conflict, but the economic policies of war communism had completely alienated the vast peasant majority.
Right. Lenin faced mass uprisings in the Tambov region. He faced the mutiny of the Revolutionary Vanguard itself, the sailors at the Kronstadt naval base.
And the country was experiencing a horrific famine. Millions were dying. Lenin realized that if the state continued to wage war on the peasantry, the regime was going to collapse from within.
So Lenin pulls off a massive strategic retreat. He looks at the dashboard of USSR Ltd. And realizes the engine is literally tearing itself apart. And so he introduces the new economic policy, the NEP, in 1921.
And the NEP is essentially a pivot to a mixed economy. It's a profound compromise.
How did it work mechanically?
Well, the state maintained its grip on the commanding heights of the economy. So that's large-scale heavy industry, the banking sector, the transportation grid, and they kept a strict monopoly on foreign trade.
Right, the big stuff.
Exactly. But the lower levels of the economy were abruptly liberalized. The grain requisitioning squads were recalled, and they were replaced by a fixed tax in kind. But most importantly, peasants were suddenly allowed to sell their surplus agricultural products on an open, legalized market for profit.
They resurrected money. They introduced a new gold-backed currency called the shervanets to kill off the hyperinflation.
And you have to imagine it required a complete psychological rewiring for the Bolsheviks. They had spent years totally demonizing trade, and now they suddenly had to facilitate it.
There is this famous, somewhat hilarious exchange in the text where a hardened party cadre is complaining to Lenin. He says, "They didn't teach us how to trade in prison."
Yeah, and Lenin shoots back, "Were we taught how to administer a state in prison?"
So pragmatic. And I mean, the short-term results of the NEP were undeniably miraculous. By restoring basic market incentives, agricultural production rapidly rebounded.
Markets were flooded with food again. Small-scale private manufacturing and retail operations, run by the so-called netmen, they sprang up everywhere to meet consumer demand. The economy largely recovered to its pre-war 1913 baseline within a few years.
But the NEP was structurally unstable. It created a profound macroeconomic contradiction that erupted in 1923. It's known as the Scissors Crisis.
Let's break down the mechanics of the scissors crisis, because it's the absolute perfect illustration of why a half-planned, half-market economy really struggles to balance itself out.
Okay, yeah. Let's visualize this. If we imagine a graph tracking prices over time, we essentially have two distinct lines: the price of agricultural goods and the price of industrial goods. Prior to World War I, these two prices existed in a rough equilibrium. They tracked together. But by 1923, the line for industrial prices just rockets upward, while the line for agricultural prices plunges downward. The graph literally opens up like a pair of scissors.
And the mechanics driving those lines in opposite directions were fundamentally structural. Think about agriculture. It consisted of roughly 25 million independent peasant households.
So it's highly fragmented.
Highly fragmented, highly competitive, and it required very little capital to restart after the war. You just needed seeds and basic tools. Therefore, agricultural production recovered really quickly, which flooded the market with grain and naturally drove prices down.
Right. But industry was fundamentally different.
Completely different. Heavy industry was completely monopolized by the state. It was organized into these massive trusts, and those trusts were incredibly inefficient.
Yeah, they're dealing with decaying machinery, lack of raw materials, high labor costs.
Exactly. So, to cover their massive inefficiencies, the state trusts used their monopoly power to artificially jack up the prices of industrial goods: plows, boots, textiles.
And the resulting terms of trade for the peasant were just catastrophic. Imagine you're a peasant. You take a cart full of grain to the market, but you have to sell it for pennies because of the agricultural glut.
Right.
And then you walk into a state-run store to buy a new plow, only to find the price is astronomically high. The rational economic response for the peasant is immediate.
They withdraw from the market.
Exactly. If my grain can't buy me anything useful, I'm not going to sell it. I'll eat it, I'll feed it to my livestock, or, I'll distill it into vodka.
But the moment the peasantry withdraws from the market, USSR Ltd faces an existential crisis.
Why? Because the state has nothing to export.
Yes, if the state cannot acquire grain, it cannot feed the industrial proletariat in the cities, and more importantly, it has nothing to export to buy foreign machinery. The entire industrialization drive just stalls completely.
So the state forcefully intervened, right? They pressured the industrial trusts to slash their prices and essentially close the scissors.
They did. But the crisis exposed this incredibly fragile vulnerability of the Soviet state. It triggered the great debate of the 1920s.
And this is arguably the most rigorous, high-stakes intellectual debate in the history of development economics. The board of directors of USSR Ltd realized they desperately needed a long-term strategy.
The core question was, how do you construct a massive, modern, heavily industrialized superpower when the entire foundation of your economy rests on this unpredictable, million-strong peasantry who effectively hold your food supply hostage?
Right. And you have two incredibly brilliant factions proposing diametrically opposed strategies to solve this. Let's look at the right wing of the party first, the gradualists.
Right. And their primary intellectual champion is actually Nikolai Bukharin.
Which is wild. He completed a total 180-degree turn from his radical war communism days.
He really did. He's supported by brilliant economists like Lev Shanin, and their approach centers on what was called genetic planning.
Unpack genetic planning for us.
So genetic planning operates on the premise that you must respect the inherent genes or the underlying market realities of the economy.
Yeah.
You cannot simply will an industrial base into existence. You have to grow it organically based on supply, demand, and existing capacity.
Right. So Shannon, when he was analyzing investment criteria, he argued that capital in an impoverished country should be deployed where it yields the fastest return.
Exactly. And in the 1920s Soviet Union, that meant agriculture and light industry. It did not mean massive, capital-intensive steel mills that take a decade to build and start seeing a return on.
Bukharin had this famous pitch to the peasantry. He literally told them, enrich yourselves.
Which shocked a lot of old-school Bolsheviks.
I bet. The gradualist strategy was essentially to offer the peasants favorable prices, encourage them to maximize their production, and let them accumulate wealth.
And then, the state would gently tax that growing rural wealth. The massive surplus of grain would be exported to gradually import foreign machinery, while domestic light industry would produce consumer goods to keep the peasants motivated to keep selling.
It's balanced evolutionary growth.
It is. It's a highly rational, economically sound strategy. But it possessed a fatal political flaw.
The pace.
The pace. The gradualist approach meant that the industrialization of the Soviet Union would proceed at the speed of the peasant's horse-drawn plow.
And for the left wing of the party, who felt completely surrounded by hostile capitalist nations, that pace was totally unacceptable.
They felt they were running out of time.
Which brings us to the left opposition. This faction is spearheaded intellectually by the brilliant economist Evgeny Preobrazhensky, and his theory is called primitive socialist accumulation.
And this theory is intense.
Yeah.
Preobrazhensky looks backward at the history of capitalist industrialization. He asks, how did Britain amass the massive capital required to build the factories of the Industrial Revolution?
Marx called it primitive accumulation. It was the violent enclosure of peasant lands and the systematic exploitation of overseas colonies. Britain pumped wealth out of India and the Caribbean to fund Manchester and Birmingham.
But the Soviet Union in the 1920s did not possess an India. It had no overseas colonies to exploit.
So where does the capital come from?
Preobrazhensky ruthlessly concluded that if the state was going to rapidly accumulate industrial capital, it had to colonize its own private sector.
Wow.
The internal colony was the Russian peasantry.
That is just chilling. Let's walk through the exact legend of how you colonize your own citizens. Since USSR Ltd. controls both the industrial monopolies and the foreign trade monopoly, it effectively controls the pricing mechanism, right?
Precisely. Preobrazhensky advocated for what was called teleological planning.
Okay, contrasting with genetic planning.
Right. Teleological planning is based not on current market realities, but on a predetermined ultimate goal, dictated purely by the will of the state. The mechanism of extraction was unequal exchange.
So the state would deliberately set the procurement price for agricultural goods artificially low.
Yes. And simultaneously, it would set the retail price for state-produced industrial goods artificially high.
Okay, so let's put numbers to it. If I am a peasant and it costs me, say, 50 rubles in labor and materials to produce a ton of grain, the state forces me to sell it to them for only 20 rubles.
Right. You take a loss.
And when I go to buy a pair of boots that cost the state 10 rubles to manufacture, the state charges me 50 rubles.
Exactly. And that margin, the massive profit generated by that price manipulation, goes directly into the state budget to build a hydroelectric dam or a tractor factory.
It is institutionalized exploitation designed to force unbalanced growth.
It is. And while it sounds draconian, Preobrazhensky was identifying a very harsh mathematical truth of development economics. It's something that later economists like W. Arthur Lewis and Albert Hirschman would explore in different contexts.
The idea being that if an agrarian society wishes to leapfrog into heavy industrialization without massive foreign investment, the capital has to be squeezed out of the agricultural sector. There's literally no other source of wealth.
Exactly. But the immediate political pushback to Preobrazhensky's theory is obvious.
Yeah. If you openly declare that state policy is to systematically exploit the 80% of the population that grows your food, you're basically inviting a catastrophic rebellion.
The peasant will just stop growing food. They'll recreate the scissors crisis on a massive national scale.
Which is exactly why the left opposition was outmaneuvered and politically destroyed in the late 1920s. Joseph Stalin allied with Bukharin and the gradualists to denounce Preobrazhensky and Leon Trotsky.
They labeled primitive socialist accumulation as politically suicidal, a danger to the worker-peasant alliance. Stalin effectively purged the left from power entirely.
And this leads to one of the darkest ironies in political history. Once Stalin consolidates absolute unassailable power over the board of directors, he looks at the international situation. He perceives an inevitable future war with the capitalist West.
Right.
And he realizes that Bukharin's gentle, slow, peasant-led growth will never, ever build a military-industrial complex capable of surviving that war. So what does Stalin do? He completely steals the economic policies of the left opposition he just destroyed, and he turns the dial up to an apocalyptic level.
He recognizes the fundamental flaw in relying on the market mechanism during the NEP. As long as the peasant retained ownership of the grain, the peasant effectively dictated the pace of industrialization.
Because they could just withhold it.
Right. To accelerate growth to the speed Stalin demanded, the state had to seize physical control of the food supply. The market had to be annihilated.
This catapults us into the horror of the Soviet Great Leap Forward at the end of the 1920s. The mixed economy of the NEP is totally torn apart by the sudden, violent collectivization of agriculture. Between 1929 and 1934, the state essentially wages war on its own countryside.
Private farming was outlawed. Millions of individual peasant households were forced to surrender their land, their tools, their livestock, merging them into these massive, state-controlled collective farms, the kolkhozes.
And the human devastation defies comprehension. The wealthier, more efficient peasants, the so-called kulaks, they were, quote, liquidated as a class.
They were arrested, deported to the Siberian gulags, or simply left to starve in the wilderness.
It's horrific. And the remaining peasants realized that if they surrendered their livestock to the collective farm, they would lose everything anyway. So in this act of desperate economic sabotage, they slaughtered their own animals.
The statistics in the text are just staggering.
Yeah.
Half of the nation's horses, cattle, and sheep were killed by the peasantry within a few short years.
Half. That massive destruction of agricultural capital, combined with relentless state grain requisitions, triggered famines in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the Volga region that killed millions upon millions of people.
It was a demographic and human catastrophe of unprecedented scale. But if we analyze collectivization strictly from the cold, sociopathic perspective of USSR Ltd's board of directors, it achieved its core mechanical objective.
Absolute state control.
Yes. The kolkhoz was essentially a mechanism for surplus extraction. The state dictated exactly how much grain the collective farm had to deliver to the state elevators, and the state set the procurement price at levels that were practically confiscatory.
The state secured the guaranteed food supply it needed to feed the rapidly expanding industrial cities, and it secured the grain it needed to export for foreign machinery, utterly regardless of whether the peasants who grew the grain starved to death.
There's a Menshevik critic quoted in the text who summarized it perfectly. He called it primitive socialist accumulation by the methods of Tamerlane.
Tamerlane being the notoriously brutal 14th century conqueror, it's such an apt description, but it raises a deeply debated economic question among scholars.
Right. Did it actually work?
Exactly. Did this immense violence actually accomplish its goal of funding industrialization? Or did the peasants' destruction of half the nation's livestock wipe out so much capital that the whole exercise was fundamentally counterproductive?
That specific question has generated fierce debate among economic historians. James Millar, for example, famously argued that collectivization was an economic disaster that failed to generate a net surplus.
Because of the dead horses?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because the peasants slaughtered the draft animals, the horses. The state was forced to divert massive amounts of precious industrial capital into rapidly building tractor factories just to maintain basic agricultural production. The flow of resources, Miller argues, might have actually been a net drain on the state.
But then you have scholars like Michael Ellman who counter that regardless of the strict financial flow, collectivization absolutely facilitated the physical mechanics of industrialization. Well, by deliberately impoverishing the countryside and replacing labor with basic mechanization, the state forced millions of desperate peasants to flee the villages and migrate to the cities. That provided the massive, cheap industrial labor force required for the new factories.
Right. Regardless of which side of the net surplus debate you fall on, the undeniable macroeconomic result of the 1930s was the complete crystallization of the Stalinist model.
The market was dead.
Dead. It was replaced entirely by the command economy. And the central brain of that economy was Gosplan, the State Planning Committee.
The implementation of the first five-year plan is where economic forecasting totally detaches from reality and basically becomes pure political theater. Planners weren't looking at supply and demand. They were engaged in teleological planning on absolute steroids.
They were setting targets to increase coal and steel production by 100%, 200% in a matter of just a few years.
And when those initial targets were inevitably missed, the Politburo didn't scale them back. They revised them upwards.
Because the plan was no longer an economic blueprint. It was a mechanism of total societal mobilization. To manage this impossibly complex system without the use of market prices, Gosplan had to rely on a system called material balances.
Explain material balances. How do you plan an economy without prices?
Planners essentially treated the entire national economy like a giant physical input-output table. They calculated everything in physical volumes. So if we have X million tons of steel and Y million tons of coal, we can physically produce Z number of tanks and tractors.
It is literally treating a continent-spanning empire like a game of logistical Tetris. But the pieces are real, heavy, and geographically dispersed. Take the Ural-Kuznetsk Combine, which Nove highlights in the text.
Oh, this project is mind-blowing when viewed through a traditional capitalist lens.
Totally. Planners decided to pair the massive iron ore deposits in the Ural Mountains with the massive coal deposits in the Kuznetsk Basin in Siberia.
Two regions separated by over 1,000 miles of harsh terrain.
1,000 miles. They are continuously shipping millions of tons of coal and iron ore back and forth across an entire continent just to smelt steel. If you are a capitalist firm, the transportation costs alone absolutely annihilate any possibility of financial profitability. The project makes 0 sense on a spreadsheet, but USSR Ltd executed it anyway. Why?
Because their metric of success was not financial profitability. It was long-term strategic autarky.
Self-sufficiency.
Right. Stalin recognized the extreme vulnerability of having the Soviet industrial base concentrated in the western regions, right near the borders of potentially hostile European powers.
Ah.
The Ural-Kuznetsk Combine was designed to create an impenetrable, self-sufficient industrial fortress deep within the Eurasian interior. And while it was an absolute economic black hole in terms of efficiency, that exact geographical positioning is arguably what saved the Soviet Union from total defeat when the Germans invaded in 1941 and captured all the Western industrial zones.
Wow, it just demonstrates how a command economy can forcefully execute massive, singular priorities, completely ignoring standard economic costs. But to enforce that level of compliance against all economic logic requires sheer terror.
Unimaginable terror. In the 1930s, failing to meet an impossible production target wasn't viewed as a systemic planning error. It was prosecuted as treason.
The Industrial Party trials of the late 1920s and early 1930s established a chilling precedent. Engineers, technicians, factory managers who failed to fulfill their quotas or whose machinery broke down under the immense strain of the plans. They were accused of being deliberate capitalist saboteurs.
The technical intelligentsia was paralyzed by fear.
Right. If you are a factory manager and you receive an order from Gosplan that is physically impossible to fulfill with your current supply of raw materials, you do not write a memo to Moscow explaining the mathematical error.
No, doing so marks you as a defeatist, or worse, a saboteur.
You simply accept the quota, keep your head down, and figure out how to manipulate the numbers to survive.
Which perfectly transitions us into the inherent contradictions of how the system actually measured its own success.
The illusions.
Exactly. If you read the official Soviet statistical publications from the 1930s, the economy appears to be expanding at impossible rates, like 15%, 20% annual industrial growth.
While the capitalist West is suffocating in the depths of the Great Depression.
Right. The sheer volume of output was increasing, yes, but the dashboard measuring that output was profoundly distorted.
This is the crux of the illusion. Let's dig deeply into the methodology of how USSR Ltd generated those growth numbers, starting with the index number problem.
This is a dense statistical concept, but it explains so much of the systemic dysfunction. Think about it. How do you measure the growth of an entire economy? You have to aggregate millions of wildly different products.
Right, you can't just add 100 tractors to 10,000 pairs of shoes and 50 tons of butter. It doesn't make sense.
No, you have to assign them all a unified value, and that value is usually determined by prices from a specific base year.
Right, so to create an index of industrial production, the Soviet statisticians selected the prices of the year 1926-27 as their base.
But think about the state of Soviet industry in 1926. They were barely producing any heavy machinery at all.
Oh, right. So if a factory built a tractor or a complex machine tool in 1926, it was practically a custom-built artisanal prototype.
Exactly. And because it was incredibly difficult to produce, its assigned price in 1926 rubles was astronomically high.
I see where this is going.
So that assigned high price becomes locked into the statistical formula as a constant weight. Fast forward to the mid-1930s. The massive new factories built during the 5-year plans are now mass-producing those exact same tractors. The actual cost of production has plummeted due to economies of scale.
But when the factory manager logs his total output for the central planners, he is still multiplying every single mass-produced tractor by that astronomically high 1926 prototype price.
You got it. It artificially inflates the gross industrial output index to a staggering degree.
The introduction of any new product lines, which obviously happens constantly during rapid industrialization, created massive statistical distortions because new, complex goods were always priced high initially.
And factory managers aggressively exploited this.
How?
Well, if you needed to hit a massive ruble output quota, You stopped producing cheap, basic goods like nails or simple tools. You shifted your entire production line to the expensive new machinery, simply because the 1926-27 accounting trick made it mathematically easier to fulfill the plan.
The growth rate looked exponential on paper, but it was heavily distorted by what economists call the Gerschenkron effect. And this statistical illusion was compounded by the administrative nightmare known as the ratchet principle.
Ah, the ratchet principle. This is the ultimate behavioral trap of the command economy. Central planners in Moscow didn't have market prices to signal supply and demand, and they didn't actually know the true physical capacity of the thousands of factories spread across the continent.
So how do they set the target for next year?
They simply look at what the factory produced this year, and they ratchet it up. If your textile mill produced 1,000 shirts this year, Gosplan demands 1,100 shirts next year. The ratchet only clicks in one direction, upwards.
Now place yourself in the shoes of a Soviet factory manager. You are judged, rewarded, and potentially imprisoned based solely on whether you hit that specific target. If your factory undergoes a surge of efficiency and you actually possess the capacity to produce 1,500 shirts, what do you do?
If I produce 1,500 shirts, Gosplan will praise me, give me a medal, and then set my target for the following year at 1,600 shirts.
Exactly. And if my supply of cotton gets delayed next year, and I only produce 1,400 shirts, I miss the plan, I lose my bonus, and I might get investigated for sabotage.
So the rational survival strategy is universal deception. I will carefully restrict my output to exactly 1,001 shirts. I will systematically hide my true productive capacity.
Furthermore, you will hoard every raw material you can get your hands on. If you receive an extra shipment of steel, you don't report it. You hide it in the warehouse.
Because you know the supply chains are unreliable, and you will absolutely need that steel to meet next year's ratcheted target. It created an economy characterized by simultaneous chronic shortages and massive hidden hoarding.
It also completely killed technological innovation at the enterprise level. If installing a new, highly efficient assembly line requires shutting down the factory floor for 3 weeks, a manager will refuse to do it.
Shutting down means missing this month's gross output target, which means failing the plan. The system punished the very disruption that drives long-term economic growth.
Which brings us to the most perverse structural incentive of all, the concept of the Zatratnoy, or cost-inducing economy.
It's just fascinating.
Because the entire system lacked a concept of profitability based on consumer demand, success was evaluated almost entirely on valve gross output value.
Right.
Let's expand deeply on the bicycle analogy from Nove's text to illustrate exactly how destructive this was. In a capitalist firm, the imperative is to minimize input costs to maximize the final profit margin, right?
Always. Cut costs, boost profit.
But in the Soviet system, maximizing the input cost actually maximized the metric of success. Okay, imagine the production chain of a bicycle.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Factory A manufactures the metal frame and the gears. They calculate the total cost of their labor and materials, add a small administrative markup, and log their gross output at 60 rubles. They ship those components to Factory B.
Got it. 60 rubles so far.
Factory B manufactures the tires and the pedals. They take the 60 ruble frame, add their 25 rubles of value, and they log their gross output at 85 rubles. Finally, it goes to Factory C.
Okay, Factory C puts it together.
Exactly. Factory C doesn't manufacture anything. They simply tighten the bolts, assemble the final bicycle, add 15 rubles of assembly labor, and log the final gross output at 100 rubles.
Makes sense. 100 ruble bike.
But wait, when Gosplan calculates the total volume of the bicycle industry, they add the gross output of Factory A, B, and C together. 60 plus 85 plus 100.
Wait, really?
Yes. The statistical dashboard says the economy just produced 245 rubles worth of bicycle.
Oh my God. They're triple counting the exact same steel frame at every stage of production.
The statistical padding is absurd, but the behavioral consequence is catastrophic. Because Factory C's bonus is tied to increasing its total gross output value, the manager of Factory C has a vested interest in the inputs being as expensive as possible.
Wait, let me make sure I'm following. If the engineers at Factory A invent a revolutionary new, lightweight alloy that cuts the cost of the frame in half.
A capitalist system would reward them, right? But in the Soviet system, if the frame suddenly costs 30 rubles instead of 60, the final gross output of Factory C plummets. They miss their target.
Oh, wow. The entire supply chain is structurally incentivized to reject efficiency.
They want to use heavier steel, thicker glass, and the most expensive components available, simply to artificially inflate the valve. The system literally rewards the maximum waste of physical resources.
That is just. It's an economy operating completely blind. Prices are functioning purely as arbitrary accounting units, not as signals of scarcity or social utility.
Right. If consumers desperately want shoes, the price of shoes doesn't rise to incentivize factories to produce more. The price remains frozen by the state, and a massive line of angry citizens forms outside the store. The central planners cannot read the dashboard because the gauges are fundamentally broken.
A brilliant historical example of this blindness is the 1955 agricultural delegation to England, which is mentioned in the text.
Oh, the tractors.
Yes, Soviet agriculture was struggling, and a delegation of ministers visited British farms. They observed these modern, small, highly maneuverable wheeled tractors that could be fitted with dozens of different attachments for specific crops.
Flexible, efficient technology. Exactly what the Soviet collective farms desperately needed to boost productivity.
And the Soviet ministers look at these brilliant machines, recognize their absolute utility, and realize they are completely incapable of manufacturing them. They were paralyzed by the sheer momentum of their own planning methodology. The massive Soviet tractor factories were retooled to produce gigantic, heady Caterpillar-tracked vehicles. Gosselin measured the success of these factories based on the sheer physical tonnage of their gross output.
Tonnage. Weight.
Yes. If a factory manager halted the production of a 10-ton behemoth to produce 5 highly efficient 1-ton wheeled tractors, the factory's gross output by weight would collapse by 50%.
The manager would be penalized for adopting superior technology.
Exactly. Technical conservatism was hardwired into the planning metrics. The plan could measure sheer volume, but it was utterly incapable of measuring actual human utility.
This inherent blindness is what drives us into the post-Stalin era, the long slide into systemic decay. Stalin dies in 1953. The extreme administrative terror that held the system together begins to recede.
But the massive, cumbersome economic machine he constructed remains largely intact.
Right. And as the Soviet economy modernizes, as it attempts to move beyond just pouring concrete and smelting basic steel into manufacturing chemicals, electronics, and complex consumer goods, the sheer mathematical impossibility of central planning becomes overwhelming.
Nikita Khrushchev attempted to solve this in the late 1950s. He recognized that the hyper-centralized ministries in Moscow had become a massive bureaucratic bottleneck.
A factory manager in Vladivostok had to request permission from a minister in Moscow just to change a minor production process. It was absurd.
So Khrushchev's solution was radical decentralization. He dismantled many of the central ministries and transferred administrative power to regional economic councils, known as the Sovnarkozy.
But Khrushchev altered the administrative flowchart without altering the fundamental economic mechanism. He didn't introduce market prices or profit motives.
Exactly the problem. Without universal market signals to guide resource allocation, these regional councils began acting like independent feudal fiefdoms.
They started hoarding.
Yes, they hoarded scarce resources within their own geographic borders. A council in Ukraine would refuse to ship critical components to a factory just across the border in Russia, prioritizing its own regional output targets over the national plan.
So Khrushchev's reforms merely multiplied the bottlenecks. He replaced central ministry autarky with regional localism.
The system rejects the reform and overthrows Khrushchev, ushering in the era of Leonid Brezhnev. And this period, stretching through the 1970s and early 1980s, is historically defined as Zastoy stagnation.
On the surface, the Soviet Union achieves strategic nuclear parity with the United States. It projects the image of a massive superpower, but internally, the economic engine is seizing up.
The era of extensive growth has ended.
Explain extensive growth.
Extensive growth is the ability to generate growth simply by throwing millions of surplus peasants into newly built factories or opening up new, easily accessible coal mines. But those labor reserves were exhausted. The easily accessible raw materials in the West were depleted, forcing the state to extract resources from the frozen, prohibitively expensive expanses of Siberia.
To maintain its status, the economy desperately needed to pivot to intensive growth. It needed to increase productivity, innovate, develop computer technology, optimize efficiency.
But as we've discussed with the ratchet principle and the Wells indicators, the command economy was fundamentally allergic to innovation and efficiency.
A perfect physical manifestation of this stagnation was the phenomenon of Dolgostroy, the long build.
Right. Enterprise managers across the country constantly lobbied Moscow for state funds to construct new factories. Because capital was allocated by the state and essentially free for the enterprise, every minister wanted a new project to expand their bureaucratic empire.
Gazprom would approve the projects, but the economy didn't actually possess the physical materials, the cement, the steel, the labor, to complete them all.
So construction would begin on thousands of massive industrial sites across the country, but the supply chains would fail. The projects would stall.
The Soviet landscape became dotted with half-finished, rusting skeletons of factories that sat abandoned for 5, 10, sometimes 20 years.
Yeah.
Billions of rubles of state capital were frozen in useless, incomplete assets, generating absolutely no return for the economy.
The stagnation deepened. The technological gap with the West widened drastically with the dawn of the microprocessor age. And the concealed military-industrial complex continued to silently drain the highest quality resources from the civilian sector.
By the mid-1980s, the board of directors of USSR Ltd. realized they were steering a massive ship that was slowly sinking under its own weight.
Enter Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985, the final CEO.
Gorbachev examines the decaying balance sheets, the chronic shortages, and the technological stagnation, and he concludes that radical systemic restructuring is the only path to survival.
He introduces two foundational economic policies. But as Nove's text masterfully points out, these two policies were in direct, fatal mathematical contradiction with each other.
Yes. Uskoreny and Perestroika. Let's unpack this contradiction. What was Uskoreny?
Uskoreny translates to acceleration. It was a traditional, almost Stalinist command economy directive. Gorbachev wanted to jolt the economy out of its lethargy by demanding higher output targets, tightening central workplace discipline, and ordering massive state investment into the machine-building sector. The center was pushing the accelerator to the floor.
But at the exact same time, he introduces Perestroika, which translates to restructuring. The core legislation of Perestroika was the law on state enterprises.
Right.
Gorbachev basically told the factory managers across the country, "You are now autonomous. The ministries will no longer micromanage you. You must adopt self-financing, balance your own books, negotiate your own supply contracts, and act like independent quasi-market entities."
The contradiction was structurally impossible to resolve. You cannot demand that a factory fulfill a strict, centrally mandated physical quota for the state, which inherently requires guaranteed central allocation of supplies, while simultaneously telling that exact same factory manager to navigate the chaotic, unpredictable waters of independent market contracting.
I want to use an analogy to really illustrate the absurdity of this dual mandate. Imagine an Olympic swimmer standing on the starting block.
Okay.
The coach representing Uskoreny tells the swimmer, "I need you to swim in a perfectly rigid straight line within lane 4 at a precise cadence to hit a world record time. Do not deviate."
A very strict plan.
Right. But simultaneously, the same coach representing Perestroika tells the swimmer, "Also, you are now completely autonomous. You are free to explore the entire ocean, hunt for your own food, and swim wherever the currents take you."
You literally cannot execute both commands.
Exactly. The swimmer will either follow the lane lines or they'll swim out into the ocean. By attempting to merge a rigid central plan with autonomous market behavior, Gorbachev shattered the operational logic of both.
The consequences of that shattered logic rapidly manifested as a catastrophic financial collapse. Under the traditional command economy, inflation was strictly controlled through the suppression of wages. A factory had a rigid wage fund dictated by Moscow. A manager literally could not pay a worker more than the plan allowed, regardless of performance.
But Gorbachev, seeking to incentivize productivity, decentralized this control. He gave enterprise managers the freedom to set their own wages.
And if you are a factory manager in the late 1980s, facing an increasingly chaotic supply chain and trying to keep your workers motivated and loyal, what do you do with that new freedom?
You immediately raise wages. You start handing out massive bonuses.
But, and this is the fatal error that destroyed the Soviet consumer market, while Gorbachev lifted the ceiling on wages, the state stubbornly maintained its strict control over retail prices.
Oh, no.
Yes. The price of meat, bread, housing, and basic consumer goods remained artificially frozen at levels that often hadn't changed since the 1960s.
So, we have a scenario where factory managers are essentially printing money to pay higher wages, but the physical production of goods hasn't actually increased, and the prices in the stores haven't been allowed to rise to absorb that excess cash. Suddenly, the entire urban population has pockets bulging with rubles.
Economists refer to this condition as a massive monetary overhang or frustrated purchasing power. When a population has massive amounts of unspendable cash in a fixed price system, The result is the instantaneous evaporation of inventory.
Citizens just rushed to the state stores and compulsively bought absolutely everything they could find, whether they needed it or not, simply to convert their rapidly depreciating paper money into physical assets.
The chronic, manageable shortages of the Brezhnev era suddenly mutated into an apocalyptic collapse of retail supply. Basic survival goods, soap, matches, light bulbs, tea, sugar vanished from the shelves entirely. You had citizens queuing for hours just to stare at empty display cases.
Simultaneously, the macroeconomic balance sheet of USSR Ltd was imploding. Gorbachev's well-intentioned anti-alcohol campaign wiped out one of the state's most lucrative sources of turnover tax revenue, vodka sales.
And the global price of oil plummeted at the same time, instantly crippling the state's ability to earn the foreign hard currency it desperately needed to import grain and technology.
Confronted with a massive, surging budget deficit, the central government resorted to the oldest, most destructive financial trick in history. They quietly instructed the state bank to print billions of unbacked rubles to cover the shortfall.
Which acts like throwing high-octane gasoline onto the invisible fire of hidden inflation.
By 1990 and 1991, the ruble had effectively lost its function as a currency, mirroring the exact hyperinflationary collapse of war communism in 1920. The economy regressed 70 years in the span of a few months.
It devolved into a primitive, desperate barter system. The central ministries in Moscow completely lost control over resource allocation. A coal mine in Ukraine would refuse to send coal to the state. Instead, they would put the coal on a train and trade it directly with a massive collective farm in Russia in exchange for meat, just to physically feed the miners.
The integration of the national economy shattered.
Yeah.
USSR Ltd was fundamentally bankrupt. It could no longer pay its suppliers, it could no longer stock its stores, and its currency was worthless. The board of directors had entirely lost control of the firm.
Which really brings us to the profound conclusions of this deep dive. Let's connect the brutal reality of Chapter 1 to the catastrophic collapse in Chapter 15.
The command economy was constructed by Stalin in the 1930s for a singular, brutal purpose: to force the rapid, heavy industrialization of a backward peasant society. It relied on overwhelming political coercion, immense human sacrifice, and the violent extraction of agricultural capital.
And in a horrific, bloody sense, it functioned. It built the steel mills, it built the tanks that defeated Nazi Germany, and it propelled a peasant empire into the nuclear age.
But the very mechanisms that allowed it to forcefully construct a rudimentary industrial base, the eradication of the market, the suppression of price signals, the reliance on gross output targets, and the top-down dictation of all economic activity became fatal flaws once the society modernized.
As the economy evolved from smelting basic pig iron to requiring sophisticated electronics, diverse consumer services, and constant technological innovation, the absolute lack of objective market data blinded the system.
Without real prices to indicate true scarcity, without a profit motive to incentivize efficiency, and without a consumer feedback loop to penalize the production of useless goods, the Soviet economy rotted from the inside. It possessed immense physical mass, but it lacked a nervous system.
And this reveals the ultimate paradox of the Soviet collapse. When Mikhail Gorbachev looked at the suffocating stagnation of the 1980s, he realized that the immense entrenched bureaucracy was the primary obstacle to economic restructuring.
So, to overcome that bureaucratic resistance, he attempted to democratize the state. He introduced glasnost, openness, he allowed public criticism, he allowed the press to investigate the failures of the ministries, and he eventually allowed multi-candidate elections.
But in his attempt to save the economy by democratizing the politics, he inadvertently destroyed the only structural mechanism that made the command economy function.
A command economy fundamentally requires a command polity. It requires a dictator or an utterly ruthless centralized party apparatus willing to apply immense coercive pressure to force the factory managers to fulfill their quotas and to force the supply chains to link up despite the mathematical absurdities.
The threat of the Gulag, or at least severe party discipline, was the engine of compliance. When Gorbachev removed the whip of authoritarian terror through political liberalization, the economic system simply stopped responding to orders from Moscow.
And because he had not yet introduced the carrot of genuine market incentives and private property rights, there was nothing to replace the whip.
The board of directors fired the security guards, dismantled the disciplinary committees, but forgot to implement a profit-sharing bonus system for the employees.
The workforce looked around, realized nobody was forcing them to hit the impossible targets anymore, and the entire monopolistic firm disintegrated along its internal administrative borders into 15 independent republics.
The history of USSR Ltd stands as the most profound, deeply researched lesson in the absolute necessity of accurate feedback mechanisms in any large-scale human organization. It is a testament to the hubris of believing that administrative decree can permanently substitute for the organic, decentralized signaling of human valuation.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to consider as we wrap up this deep dive. We've spent an intense hour dissecting the catastrophic arrogance of Soviet central planners men sitting in Moscow offices, utilizing primitive input-output tables, attempting to mathematically calculate and dictate the exact needs and desires of hundreds of millions of citizens without utilizing market prices.
It's easy to look back at the 1930s and dismiss it as an archaic, analog failure.
But consider the architecture of our modern, hyper-connected global economy. We are increasingly relying on massive, highly centralized, opaque, algorithmic systems developed by a handful of tech monopolies to predict consumer behavior, to curate the flow of global information, and to allocate vast digital and physical resources.
Are we, in our reliance on these centralized black boxes, risking the creation of a 21st century digital version of the Soviet index number problem?
It is a genuinely unsettling parallel. If a massive monopolistic tech platform optimizes its algorithms purely for its own internal self-referential metrics, maximizing engagement time, prioritizing click-through rates, or generating sheer data volume, rather than optimizing for organic, genuine human utility and well-being, well, it is structurally replicating the exact flaw of the Soviet factory manager.
It is aggressively producing massive, heavy Caterpillar tractors when the populace desperately requires light, flexible, wheeled ones. It is optimizing the system for digital val, for gross output of data and attention, while remaining entirely blind to the compounding social costs.
How long can a digitally planned, algorithmically driven system sustain itself before its internal metrics become completely decoupled from reality? Before the dashboard stops reflecting human needs entirely? Think about that structural vulnerability the next time a platform's algorithm forcefully attempts to dictate what you should value or what information you should consume. Because as the board of directors of USSR Ltd discovered at the cost of an empire, when you break the dashboard and ignore the true signals of the system, eventually the entire machine crashes.